What the heck is this, you may be wondering? Well, I'm kind of playing around with this idea of interpretation and appropriation and influences by bringing it into the fashion world. This is a Gucci show in 2017 in Florence that was presenting the brand's resort wear for 2018. We see here models, one of them anyway, walking through this beautiful gallery in one of the best known museums in Florence and in Italy. It's called the Palazzo Pitti. And they're surrounded, of course, because they're in the Palazzo Pitti. Um, just parenthetically, I was very fortunate. I used to go to the Pitti for my lunch hour when I worked and lived in Florence. Um, Models walk through the space surrounded by paintings from Titian, Raphael, Perugino, wearing these faux fur jackets, sequin embellished velvet gowns, brocade suits. Why do I have it here? The label's Resort 2018 campaign was inspired by an artist, Hieronymus Bosch, who we are studying about 3/4 of the way through this slide lecture. His most famous work, called The Garden of Earthly Delights, an absolutely outlandish and phenomenally detailed painting, created somewhere between 1505 and 1515, it's generally noted. That has been reinterpreted also in a few other whimsical images I'll pair it with into a kind of modern fantasy digital painting that incorporates elements of the Gucci show with Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. So plant that in your brain for now, and we're going to get to it a little bit later. Opening this lecture with Albrecht Dürer's, pronounced Dürer, even though it is spelled Dürer, self-portrait from 1500. Even if this portrait did not play a key, important, significant role in art history and projecting art history forward, it is still such a lush and captivating and compelling image with this kind of enigmatic, mysterious air to it that you can hardly stop looking at it. It is fair to say that no history, no compendium of self-portraiture would be complete without it. A very controversial former director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, Thomas Hoving, who's often quite provocative, once called this portrait, quote, the single most arrogant, annoying, and gorgeous portrait ever created, end quote. I'm also contrasting it directly below with Man in a Red Turban, the earlier Van Eyck portrait we looked at that showed us a more honest human, flawed, wrinkled, two-day-old stubble portrait idea of a man that in no way was prettied up, was fabricated for the camera, let's say. Van Eyck created Man in a Red Turban, self-portrait or not, that's often debated, of course, in a way that moved portraiture forward in his time, in 1433. Even though he did not sell it or label it as a self-portrait, we understand it in most areas of art history. It's agreed that it is indeed a self-portrait, but just as Man in a Red Turban moved forward self-portraiture, then in 1433 and 1500, Durer's self-portrait does the same thing. So a little bit of history. Durer's born in 1471. This was at a time when still, despite Man in a Red Turban, if artists depicted themselves, they often kept it anonymous. So that is why, in fact, when Van Eyck painted Man in a Red Turban, it was appropriate to the time, even though it was widely acknowledged it was likely him, it was appropriate for the artists to configure themselves, going back to much earlier time periods, Egyptian artists, for instance, as background actors. Well before, let's say, very early on, 1400 BC, before Christ. Moving way ahead, by the end of the Middle Ages, before the Renaissance, before where we are now, artists have begun to show themselves as again, these background figures, sometimes even as a bystander saint. And again, they really weren't moved to the foreground as subject, as the artist boldly, maybe brazenly declaring, I am important enough. This presages, it precedes, it anticipates the modernist artist's claim to identity and the right to express what they felt and thought. By the time we're getting into the 19th century, that was previously unheard of. Artists do not have agency. To do that was the idea. And by the modernist time, we move to an idea concept of the artist where it is the artist's duty, role, responsibility to rattle your cage, to challenge and provoke you in ways that were previously unimaginable, much less unheard of. So the idea of the artist and the artist's agency also extends to that artist's invitation to the viewer, to you, the audience, to complete the picture. By the time we get to Cezanne in the mid-20th century, we're looking at an artist who is declaring that you, the viewer, are the essential third component to this image, your interpretation of it. What it makes you feel, which may be different than what the artist intended, is essential. A very different way of thinking to us today, in that it's unimaginable that we, of course, would not be the most important thing, because what do? We take selfies all day. So let's look at the construction of these different roles and identities of the artist, the patron, and the viewer themselves in earlier periods of time and connect that to present. So back to Dürer. Here comes this cocky, quite frankly, young artist who first drew himself at age 13, which we see below here in this drawing. And I'm showing you two other images just below that, with each of his following portrayals, self-portrayals, after the age of 13. The one we are looking at here, the 1500 portrait, by the time we get to it. But in each of them, he shows himself gaining in elegance, I'll say, and confidence, self-confidence. In the 1493 painting, which he does clearly label as a self-portrait, he's wearing this red tasseled cap and this refined clothing. He seems more, he's growing a little more assured. By 1498, that's the portrait under the one with the red tassel, he's grown more relaxed, more confident, more assured. He stands beside a window, turning slightly to us, his audience, in these gold lace trimmed garments. But the 1500 image that we are studying is really the stunner. Dürer's bolder still. He faces us frontally, which is a rarity at the time. He stares directly and intensely at us, the viewer. His face, it may be slightly elongated, but it's certainly not mannerist. It's symmetrical. It's not odd, and it's the way that it is represented. His long curly hair tumbles down into this rich brown velvety cloak, like an extension of his hair. It's trimmed in fur, so he's showing us that he's of a certain social class. And his right hand, there is right-handed, so it's his creative hand, is extended upward, as if he is about to gesture or even give a blessing. Who gives a blessing? Priests do. How provocative and maybe even sacrilegious is that gesture? The light falls unevenly on him, highlighting his right side, enhancing the painting's realism. And he is bold enough to inscribe this painting, "Thus I, Albrecht Dürer from Nuremberg, painted myself with indelible colors at the age of 28 years." To viewers of this era, the image is unmistakably Christ-like, confident, self-conscious, spiritual, also sensual. This work of Dürer's was destined to become an icon. He accomplishes several things here. Let's look at them. On one level, he's portraying the belief that God had literally created man, and that man is everlasting. What is indisputable, however we feel about this bold declaration of Dürer's, is that he was the greatest artist of the Northern Renaissance, and not least because of this beautiful portrait. Just a few other ideas of the notion of the category of self-portraits. Here we see Hieronymus Bosch, the creator of the Garden of Earthly Delights, that we will study more intensively below. Here we have, and I'm not calling it a self-portrait, although it certainly privileges the idea of the headshot. That, of course, was not a phenomenon at the time of these earlier portraits. This is by an artist I'll return to again, that we have already looked at. He of the appropriation of the idea of street art, Jean-Michel Basquiat. We looked at subways, we looked at graffiti, and we looked at Jean-Michel Basquiat along with Warhol in our opening week 1 lecture. Returning to Albrecht Dürer here to look at his exquisite, phenomenal woodcut Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse that, for some people, reminds them of Hollywood cowboy movies. Well, let it be said that American Westerns are almost, across the board, predicated on relating to Christian themes, these archetypal themes, and are often riddled with very symbolic use of numbers. There's the 1960 Western, The Magnificent Seven, which supposedly connects to the idea of the seven virtues. And also in terms of the idea of seven vices and virtues, the contrast one to the other. There is a remake of that film, not to go into in detail, that is very closely numerically reflective of the idea of seven vices, seven virtues. There is the idea that in the iconic film High Noon, Gary Cooper, our American hero, confronts 4 villains. So these are just some ideas why Dürer's Four Horsemen, in terms of its background, the Four Horsemen are drawn from, their source is the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is the last book of the New Testament, telling of the end of the world and the coming of the kingdom of God. These 4 horsemen have always been the sinister, apocalyptic cowboys of world-ending destruction. Those are conquest, war, pestilence or famine, and death. Is that what Dürer intended? Not really. This image was made as one of a series of 15 for a 1498 edition of the Apocalypse, which was a subject of very popular interest then, and at any brink of the new millennium. 1498, almost 1500. In 2000, everyone thought that the world would collapse and that all our computers would blow up, right? But in 1511, the world hadn't ended. The plates were republished, and these further cemented in history Dürer's fame that would endure, no pun, Dürer, endure, as a printmaker. So let us remember that Dürer was the most important artist, again, of his time, Northern Renaissance, masterful painter, um, made beautiful drawings, and was also a master printmaker. In Revelation, the main distinguishing feature of the four horses is their color. White is conquest, red is war, black is famine, and pale, pallor for death. Remember Clint Eastwood's Pale Rider? Maybe that's a stretch, but it could also be calling upon that or referencing it. The horsemen arrive with conquest as a bow. They each have different attributes. Conquest has a bow, war has a sword. The Pale Rider carries a kind of a pitchfork, unleashing hell. Here's the actual text from Revelation to give you an idea of what this inspiration sounds like and was written as. Quote, so this is Rider on White Horse, the first seal. There are four seals. One is the rider on the white horse. The second seal is war. The third seal is famine. The fourth seal is death. I'll read one of them. Then I saw, quote, then I saw when the Lamb broke one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying as with a voice of thunder, come. I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. So there's quite an elaborate and detailed history behind the storyline and, let's say, the personality, the significance of each writer and what each writer represents. Technically, the quality of this woodcut is astounding. You can hear and feel, looking at these details that are the images following the main one, that you can almost hear this kind of furor of hooves clattering on stone, and these details, their shading, the purity of form and detail are really quite astonishing. Dürer had this unique genius as a woodcut artist, and that was his ability to conceive of such complex, finely detailed images in the negative. And by that, I mean, let us remember from our St. Buxom Christopher and Schongauer that a woodcut is a negative. It's a relief process, right, in which one must cut away the substance, the meat of the design in order to preserve the outlines. And before Dürer came along, this was a pretty crude thing. Even during his time, no one drew wood blocks with his finesse, with the fineness that he could accomplish, that he could realize. It's fair to say that much of the actual cutting was done by skilled craftsmen, but they were following Dürer's complex outlines. Today, there's a lot of, I don't even know if I characterize it as controversy anymore, but artists who are hiring other artists and freely acknowledge it to create things in their studios. This, however, arguably is not different than during the trajectory of art history. Many master painters we can recall have studios in which artists learn their craft and they contribute to the master's own works. So this just makes art history, if anything, far more complicated. Dürer's images here, again, quite detailed, quite textural, quite finely done. Dürer was also quite prolific. He was so prolific in both his woodcuts and engravings, which he also did, that his prints became popular models for subsequent generations of artists. And again, we know about his varied, articulate self-portraits. If we think about the 1500 self-portrait, the one we're studying, we can recall that in that quote, which has been taken apart every which way, that Dürer attached to it, he's suggesting his artistry is a gift from his creator. A gift from his creator lifts it out of the realm of craft onto the plane of genius. And if we think about the way that the artist attires himself, wearing this nobleman's coat at a time when people followed very strict dress codes that signaled their station in life. Artists were not associated with noblemen's dress. So he added this new kind of self-revelatory aspect, this genre of self-portraiture, to the existing artist repertoire at the time. And that becomes a fact because virtually every artist since, but not before Dürer, has made at least one self-portrait at one time or another. A little bit about Dürer's background, biographical. He probably always saw himself as a bit of a visionary, it seems, from the way the various, they're not multiple, of course, but ideas that art historians have configured about his upbringing and early life experiences. He was born to a goldsmith who was originally Hungarian, married into a prosperous German family. His artistic talent, if we think about that drawing he did at 13, was so evident early on. He trained in his father's workshop, the goldsmith. And it's interesting that, we don't think about, of course, goldsmith very much as a common genre now, but let's remember that Brunelleschi, he of Florence's Dome, was a goldsmith almost up until the time that he created his submission to the Florence Council as a candidate to create the Florence Dome. So Dürer was apprenticed to his father. He trained in his father's workshop, and then he apprenticed to, because they were in Nuremberg at that time, the leading painter there. When he made the 1500 self-portrait, he was already quite well traveled, so he had seen a lot, as painters did at that time. They had to travel. A lot of the northern painters, those from Flanders, had techniques that were interesting and were borrowed by, let's say, Italian painters at that time. By 1500, Dürer had already traveled quite wildly through Northern Europe and Southern Europe, through Germany, Switzerland, Italy. While it's quite evident he was always an innovator, he also was informed and grounded in these Italian Renaissance rules of proportion, perspective, linear perspective, for instance, being so important to so many Italian painters, and this idea of overall harmony. So he's able to combine all those things in these brilliantly precise woodcuts, engravings such as the Four Horsemen here. They're also just very rich, feast for the eyes, the engravings as well as paintings. And I've included his Adam and Eve here. The beautiful, extraordinary detail of these works are the reason and the reason for his being celebrated as the greatest artist of his time. We can say that right after the self-portrait. So after 1500, for 2 years, starting in 1505, Dürer returned to Venice, and there was this back and forth between the Nuremberg scholars and patrons, and those in Italy. These exchanges really informed Dürer's idea about the intellectual studies of the Italian Renaissance. And it's also important to note that although one scholar art historian informed someone interviewing him a few years ago, he said he believed that Dürer had painted the self-portrait of 1500 for himself and for his artist friends' pleasure only, not for the public, because it was so unusual. And that is an unattributed quote, in that it cannot be clearly tied to something Dürer said, but it's possible. But it seems validated by the fact that Dürer never sold this painting, his 1500 self-portrait. He kept it in his home. until not clear exactly how it happened, but it was possibly a gift. Durer's wife gifted it. Did not seem she sold it to the Nuremberg City Hall. As befits an icon, this self-portrait has been analyzed many times, maybe too much. I'll point out a few things. Some art historians have conjectured that one can see crosses in the reflection of windows in Durer's eyes, and from the gesture he's making with his hand, this again would link the way he's constructing the elements of this painting in the light of a religious theme. Well, is this true? Is it not? Sometimes, as in Freudian times, a cigar is just a cigar. We'll get to that later, but a window is just a window. The great harmonious element, again, not stretched out and a little strange like mannerism, may be related to the year 1500 and a way of trying to create solidity at a moment in time where the new millennium was feared. Other historians say this is nonsense. So again, important to note that with during every era, with every landmark and masterwork such as Durer's 1500 self-portrait is, there are endless conjectures. I'm only introducing a few, not for the purposes of your having to repeat this for testing materials, but just to give an idea of the many theories that surround iconic, historically important works of art. Here in Adam and Eve and in the Four Apostles below, we see some other examples of the superb virtuosity, the skill and craftsmanship, and the ability to render human figures that is such a hallmark of Dürer. When we look at Lucas Cranach's, or more correctly pronounced Cranach, and we think about the idea, the conceit of working with the female nude, I am just asking you to recall and keep in mind where we started out and the ways that we have been looking at the female nude and will continue to. So below we see again Titian's Venus of Urbino. Even though Nymph of the Spring is not on our study guide, I'm going to give you some food for thought here in terms of these two, because there are two Nymphs of the Spring, one by Lucas Cranach, the elder, and one by the younger, father and son, the son taking over his father's workshop later on in life. I'm going to give you some food for thought about these paintings just because they are such remarkable interpretations and representations of German adaptations of the Renaissance ideal, of the Italian Renaissance ideal. So we'll start with the idea of looking at how a classical nymph represents an Italian theme in the hands of the Cranachs, but gives it a moralizing twist, which is common to late Gothic, courtly and amorous, or love-related subjects. What's happening here? A nymph reclines beside a spring, which is potentially, possibly, perhaps, a reference to a legendary ancient Roman fountain with which a very famous verse written in an earlier time, but translated by a famous British poet in 1725, quite poetically translating the caption on the painting as, "I am the nymph of the sacred spring. Do not disturb my sleep. I am resting." Just that, very succinct and simple, and also somewhat mysterious. Modern scholarship has some different ideas about elements of this being counterfeit, but nonetheless, we won't go into that. The poem influenced the idea of and referenced Italian garden decoration, which often included fountains with attendants. However, in both actually of these Cranach nudes, we see a more Gothic than classical representation. These are both small and really astonishingly well-preserved paintings. The Lucas Cranach the Younger, shown here, is 1545 to 50 circa, a woman reclining again on the grassy bank of a river near a spring that is coming out of, emanating from a rock formation. Is it erotic? I think that's one very plausible reading. The nymph here is shown in this sort of sultry, harem-like, which of course references the idea of the odalisque and of Manet's Olympia picking up on, shown below here, the next image, Titian's Venus of Vorbino. She has these, again, half-closed eyes, these kind of rosy cheeks. She's got this bundled red dress as if she's just ripped it off and put it under her head and elbow for a pillow. There's a bow and a quiver hanging in a nearby tree, which may indicate that this nymph belongs to the huntress goddesses Diana's entourage. There's a green parrot. There's some rock partridges. These could be seen as symbols of lust, embodied in the nymph and called forth as these images, such as Venus of Urbino and Olympia, do in different periods of time, in different ways, to the eye of the male viewer. So that is to say that when we look at Titian's Venus of Urbino, we look at Manet's modernist era rendering of Olympia, we are a different viewer in a different century. And when we look at them today, we bring a whole different set of ideas and assumptions and morals to our gazing, to our view. There are a number of other images, possibly rabbits, which of course mean something very significant, and particularly Dutch still life paintings here as well. It's a very meticulously detailed background overall. And I'm only including it again in the way that there are various other interpretations. The way that the idea that these Cranach nymph are connected with the courtly idea of control of the emotions, and with the Christian and humanist era concern for the restraint of carnal desire. So this idea of constricting and abridging the lustful human propensities, a moralizing twist, again, that was common to the time and that this image reflects. Hans Baldung Green is not on our lecture guide. I'm including it here as it's part of reading for the week, just as an example of other types of painting occurring at this time, and also once again with the idea of references, one artist and movement building upon another's work, whether it's in terms of technique or theme or content. Below, I am showing you Munch's image called Love and Pain, but very more commonly referred to as Vampire, although not Munch himself. And then right under that, you see perhaps the best known of all of Edvard Munch's paintings, which is called The Scream, of a figure on a bridge, driven to some kind of distraction or high state of anxiety. If you Google this image, The Scream, you will see it in various contemporary representations. I have seen it on an iPhone cover, and a number of other places. But again, it's with the idea, I'm including these images with the idea of that trajectory. Again, not on our lecture guide, but this Munch painting, as I said, commonly referred to as Vampire, but actually called Love and Pain, as it was titled by Munch. The title Vampire was one given to it by a Polish poet, an anarchist figure in Berlin's art circles, who kind of nicknamed this painting Vampire. What do we see here? Most notably, the same thing, the same feeling that we experience when we are looking at Van Gogh's kind of out of control work, often in these spinning circles of stars and haystacks. I would characterize these elements of Van Gogh's and Munch's work as a willingness amounting to almost a compulsion, an obsession to use art as a vehicle of emotion. We could say emotion in extremis, or extreme emotion. So what Munch does is he brings his work into an up-to-the-minute content that reflect and incorporate the new century's attitudes towards sex, psychological disturbance, spirituality, all kinds of occult spiritual matters, and this idea of utopian politics. I'm jumping ahead here, but again, just emphasizing that there is a connection between different periods, different artists, different styles, and different concerns in different eras. When we talk about Albrecht Altdorfer, who was he? He was a German painter. He was, to be correct, a Saxon. The Saxons were the original Germanic tribes that invaded and settled England in the 5th century. So there is this connection between the two countries. Landscape was very popular in the 16th century, and Altdorfer is a noted proponent of landscape as subject. And I'll say a little bit more about that in the next slide. In the 15th century, painters recorded nature with this very meticulous care in their compositions, as specific as a biologist might, if a biologist were a painter. But they painted nature generally as something in the background, as a figural component of compositions that had religious subjects as their more dominant themes. So in the 16th century, let's say less religious art, we could say in the 1520s, for instance, the idea of a pure landscape was something that would give homage to, might glorify God's hand. Altdorfer's main period of accomplishment was roughly between 1480-81 and 1538. He moved from Bavaria, painted the Danube River Valley for the rest of his life. That was it. That was his narrative. So in a sense, he is more poetic, maybe even more mysterious than Durer or Cranach. Maybe he's a little bit more similar as a painter in terms of his approach and themes as Grunewald, who painted with could be characterized as a more medieval mysticism and an emotional purity and spirituality. In addition to prints and paintings, Altdorfer also made, just incidentally, chiaroscuro drawings. Chiaroscuro is a technique that describes the dramatic contrast of light and shadow, or light and dark, in a drawing or painting. He made chiaroscuro drawings, and he designed stained glass windows. Hallmarks of Altdorfer's style are brilliant colors, sometimes fantasy-like, almost fantastical, and the use of dazzling, nearly light effects. At sunset or dawn, particularly, very representative or emblematic of his paintings, which usually depicted landscape. For the most part, Altdorfer is a landscape painter. And what's important to note is that he was the first landscape painter in the modern sense. He was also a leading figure, proponent of what was called the Danube School. The Danube River is the famous river in Germany. And he really introduced landscape as the primary theme of his own art, but in a way that almost insisted that landscape deserved a position as a theme on its own, excluding, for instance, any human figurative elements in a painting or a drawing. Unlike most of his German contemporaries at that time, and maybe we could think about Dürer, he painted few portraits, and he really preferred to focus on a virgin and let's call it an unspoiled forest, or to use nature as a setting for secular, the everyday, non-religious, as well as religious paintings, or subjects, as well as religious subjects. When he did use figures at all, he did so in a way whereby the figures complemented the landscapes as opposed to being the subject matter. Are these images of his, I would ask you to consider, are they natural or are they very carefully constructed? We see these lacy pines, these kind of typically classic German fairyland castles, often framed against low mountains, and the idea of this kind of pervasive romanticism in his landscapes. What do you make of the way landscape is here depicted by the most famous painter working in Spain during the last part of the 16th century, El Greco? El Greco. We think of him in the pantheon of the greatest of the Spanish painters, along with Goya, along with Picasso. Although El Greco, which means the Greek, was, of course, originally Greek. But we associate him with Spain as that is where he arrived after working in Italy for about a decade with Titian, who painted Venus of Urbino, and studying other painters. And that's where he really made his mark as a painter and where he remained. What do we see going on here? View of Toledo is a title. It's one of two surviving landscapes painted by El Greco. And perhaps his greatest, undoubtedly I'll say his greatest surviving landscape. Here he portrays the city of Toledo in Spain, which is where El Greco lived and worked for most of his life after he arrived in that country. How do we position it? It belongs, it's fair to say, to the tradition of representative or highly emblematic characteristic of the place itself. City views so that we can recognize Toledo from this painting, rather than a clearly faithful documentary description. So in this sense, we're seeing something that's representative. It reflects the painter's style quite markedly and the way that he sees the city, rather than a more specific biological, let's even call it, representation. We can certainly recognize Toledo from this painting. You can see that if you were familiar with the city, as I am not, that the view of the eastern section from the north would have excluded the cathedral. So the artist, quite imaginatively, moved it to the left of the royal palace, which was known as the Alcazar. We see elements that can help us recognize the city, including the bridge, an ancient bridge called the Alcantara Bridge. And on the other side, there's another castle, the castle of San Servando. So again, this is an image that is highly characteristic in a stylistic sense. If we study and look at a number of El Greco's images, we would indeed recognize this as one of his. How would you contrast this El Greco landscape to one of Albrecht Altdorfer's? Try to set yourself the task of differentiating some of the characteristics of both painters. Although not on our lecture guide, I am including El Greco's other surviving landscape, View and Plan of Toledo. We are studying View of Toledo. Just to give you another example of the kind of almost bizarre style that El Greco employs, highly recognizable, if not bizarre. And when we look at El Greco's style, I'm asking you to think too about the movement of mannerism and to think about the way that the figures we looked at, the baby Jesus, the Madonna with the long neck, Pontormo, are elongated and strangely stretched out, often in their necks, their hands, their fingers. If we think about that kind of long baby Jesus depicted in the Madonna's arms, we can recognize elements of mannerism in the way that El Greco works in his own highly personalized and representative style. This El Greco painting, The Burial of Count Orgaz, is definitively, universally considered his greatest work, his masterpiece. Ever since he completed it in the late 1500s, people have been flocking to the church. It's called the Santo Tome Church in Toledo, to be moved, impressed by this 16 by 10 foot image. Think about how large a work this is and how detailed El Greco's rendering of the content of the story in this painting. El Greco, the greatest Greek painter, sculptor, and architect of the Spanish Renaissance. That is not a contradiction in terms, in that, as we know, El Greco is Greece, but he makes his life and his career in Spain. Once again, he is known for paintings where these rather mannerist looking, malleable almost, elongated, strangely, awkwardly configured sometimes, figures are lit from indiscernible sources. We can't quite tell where the light is coming from. I'm going to give a more detailed explanation and reading of this image, but to further contextualize El Greco, important to note, again, in our study of the trajectory of artists passing the baton, the torch, from generation to generation, El Greco continued to inspire artists long after his death, including avant-garde 20th century, modernism's artists such as Picasso, who was very inspired by El Greco's fluid distortions of the body. And we can see this if we closely study Picasso's work next to El Greco's. Picasso's other great inspiration was Goya, one of the three greatest Spanish painters that I have already mentioned in the context of the triumvirate, the three most significant. So what do we have here? What does the title tell us? The Burial of Count Orgaz. This is a painting that depicts numerous figures, in addition to, we can say, the miraculous circumstances surrounding the burial of Don Gonzalo Ruiz. Who is he? He's a significant patron to the church, so he's an important community cultural figure. What do we see here? If you were going to describe to someone who had never seen this painting the story it tells. There's a young boy. His name is Jorge Manuel, El Greco's son, standing to the left of St. Stephen and pointing to the saints who are lowering Orgaz's body, thereby leading our eye to the main subject. The figure directly behind and above St. Stephen, who's looking out at the viewer, at us, is a self-portrait. So, while El Greco was an accomplished portrait painter, as we can see by his painting of an image not included in this lecture guide, but his most notable portrait painting was most likely of a friar, a priest, Paravicino. The burial of the Count of Orgaz is remarkable for the number of portraits, multiple portraits, contained within such a complex and tightly constructed composition. So let's look at some of these figures. It was ordinary, it was customary for the elite, for a higher level of social class to come to the burial of other nobles and important community figures in Spain at that time, as it has always been in every time. But why would El Greco include so many of his contemporaries in a painting that is supposed to be, ostensibly, seemingly focused on a miraculous story about the Count of Orgaz? The answer to that is found in the painting's 1568 contract. Let us recall that throughout this period of time and centuries earlier, patronage is the key component in the creation of a composition. Painters are contracted to, they're commissioned to create portraits. In this contract, written in 1568, it was stipulated that portraits be included to suggest, any portraits of this event, to suggest that they witness the miracle of the burial of the Count of Orgaz, which we will get to. What El Greco does here is brilliantly combine these portraits with saintly figures, the living and the dead, the spiritual within the historical. Santo Tome was El Greco's parish church, his local church, the church he visited, and of which he was a parishioner. So he likely included people that he knew in his community, in his parish, into the painting as a sign of respect to them, as a personal nod to his own context, an association with the place and the circumstances of this painting. If we take apart some of those people in this community, we can see St. Augustine at the bottom center on the left and St. Stephen on the right, holding the Count of Orgaz, who is dressed in armor. They're lowering him into his tomb, and as they do that, we get the impression they're placing his body into the physical tomb existing in front of the painting in the burial chapel. Let's recall history here. This act is reminiscent of paintings showing the entombment, the burial of Christ, such as versions by Raphael or Titian, where Christ's body is lowered into his grave. The same thing is happening here. Perhaps El Greco adapted this, being completely aware of that painting history, in order to emphasize the solemnity, the solemnness, the gravity, and the significance of the moment, and the miraculous nature of this burial itself. And also, perhaps, in order to help people feel like they were among their contemporaries, people they would recognize, El Greco emphasized the naturalistic textures of their clothing, the reflective shine highlighting their armor, the metal of the armor, and even the faces and the skin of the individuals in the earthly realm. We again have the heavenly and the earthly combined here. St. Stephen's vestments are so detailed, we can even see a scene of his martyrdom on the lower edge of his vestment. Yet, overall, for all the naturalistic elements and earthly details of this lower scene, it still is somewhat mysterious. It has that same kind of mysteriousness in a way that Altdorfer's landscapes have, and this is certainly very much found in El Greco. If we think about his two Toledo landscapes, where are we? Are we outside at night? Are we inside the chapel? Is it daytime? This is entirely unclear. Regardless of the time of day, the dark atmosphere heightens the sense of morning and the drama of this painting. So again, we have this binary, this divide between heaven and earth. The heavenly realm is covering the upper half of the composition, where we see many figures, including angels, saints, Peter with his keys to heaven, David with his harp, John the Baptist is included, the Virgin Mary, even Christ. The Spanish King Philip II and Pope Sixtus V are also visible in the celestial, in the heavenly realm. Between Mary and Christ, an angel guides the Count of Orgaz's small soul, which looks like a baby, tiny baby, upwards, which is a gesture that we commonly found in Byzantine icons. And there's also an association of El Greco with Byzantine icons. So this is something that's very particular to this painter. The Count's soul is going to be judged by whom? By Christ in heaven, who is presiding over this entire scene. So anyone looking at the painting is also reminded, particularly at this place and time, that judgment awaits them in heaven. To help people feel like they're among their contemporaries, El Greco, again, emphasized these details of the clothing. How did he use his palette in terms of these two realms, heaven and earth? The upper heavenly realm has a much looser brushwork, style of painting, to give the figures a more ethereal quality. He also chose cooler colors, like silvers and lilacs are predominant, and they seem to shimmer and reflect the light. The lower half has a much darker earth tone palette, except for the saints, Augustine and Stephen, who, of course, are celestial. This gives the lower half a more detailed, naturalistic, a naturalistic appearance. And differences exist also in the way that, as I said, the figures in each realm are painted. Christ, Mary, and John the Baptist look more mannerist or more elongated and angular than the figures below on earth, who look more realistic. The idea of the kind of dematerialized, the wispy, the less solid of the figures in the clouds also, again, registers their difference from those who are living. And we get the idea that there's a really solid group of people surrounding Orgaz's burial. The figures are arranged like a frieze, which connotes, for the most part, murals, raised murals. They move like a line across the bottom of the half of the painting, and their heads form almost like a straight horizontal line. This it denotes the idea of a stability. And if we look at the heavenly realm, where the clouds arc upwards, there's this very disparate sense in movement in the way that those figures are moving, motion and flux. The clouds, the clusters of figures are at differing heights. So it's a marked contrast of motion with the more static, secure in a sense, secure boundaries and borders in a sense of the scene below. Even though these two realms, upper and lower, are divided, El Greco is linking them to create a unified painting. The staffs and torches held by the earthly figures, these are rising upward. So those elements, those content elements, are crossing the pictorial threshold between heaven and earth. And the figures are gazing upwards to heaven. So they're encouraging us to lift our eyes and to create a connection between these two worlds. Certain figures also echo one another. Mary and John the Baptist gather at Christ's feet, they're leaning inwards. These are not unlike the saints Stephen and Augustine who are holding the Count of Orgaz's body. Again, El Greco is the greatest painter working in Spain at the end of the 16th century, and I mentioned Byzantine iconic elements earlier. And as an addition to that, I'm noting that El Greco was trained as a Byzantine icon painter. Again, then too, this is a very large and exceptionally large painting, 16 feet high, divided into these two realms that are monumentally and strategically and masterfully joined. These two images are incidental to our discussion and lecture guide, only included here as a way to ask you to think about the very different ways in which painters historically have depicted landscape. To the right, we see the very characteristic style of Van Gogh, who we will study later when we get to the modernist period. Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights is such a world unto itself. I will mention a few highlights, and I'll just jump into a few call-outs from some of the many, many elements that can be endlessly plumbed. What happens in the Garden of Earthly Delights? Well, let's just jump back to Durs to 1500 as a point in time. If people were afraid that all hell would break loose, they at the time that Garden of Earthly Delights was painted, 1505 to 1515, it's estimated, the millennium had occurred, but what might have happened is what Bosch shows us. One element, for instance, a fountain that can be a parable of human salvation. This we can conjecture, can be thought of as representing the practice of alchemy, turning common metals into gold, and how this parallels Christ turning humans as mortals into spiritual gold through his sacrifice that provided humans with salvation. It also thought it could be many other things. It might function as a marrying chamber and be associated with the power of women seducing men. Our very first panel, however, it depicts God. And if we look very closely, we can see God looks like, in a sense, like a mad scientist in a landscape animated by these vaguely alchemical vials and beakers, scientific instruments, presiding over the introduction of Eve to Adam, which, it is to be noted, at this time was a rather rare subject. Who has painted Adam and Eve? Durer. Although they're precisely located in the foreground, at the front of the painting, in the way that they're scaled, if we're talking about perspective and scale, Adam and Eve, as well as God, are on the same level as importance as the other creatures in this fantastical paradisiac garden. Includes an elephant, a giraffe, a unicorn, other less recognizable and hybrid, bizarre creatures, along with more recognizable birds, fishes, various aquatic creatures, along with the almost unworldly creations that accompany the snakes and insects and many other true-to-life depictions here. So we'll return to this idea of this introduction of woman to man, Adam and Eve, probably clearly intended to highlight not only God's creativity, but humans' capacity for procreation. In this hierarchy of God's handiwork, what he creates on earth, Adam and Eve traditionally thought, right, that he represents God's most daring, achievement. Um, as though after he made everything else, he thought, well, maybe I need to leave a signature on the world in which I could recognize myself, assuming, of course, that God has a human form. It's really, to this day, a matter of conjecture by the time we get to the central panel as whether, here's a key note, as to whether Bosch is saying, he's telling us, his idea is that the creation of man, on whom God confers free will, might just have been a divine mistake. If we look at the eon since, if we look at where we are, and people return to this image, Garden of Earthly Delights, with that thought in mind, it is an interpretation that never stops evolving in terms of the way that question resonates differently in each, at this point, century of time. There are many, many other storylines, individual items in Garden of Earthly Delights. Some of this is covered in our reading, and I will leave it at that. And you are, of course, free to explore or to query me with any additional questions or needs for confirmation. I'm only including this photo from the Gucci show in Florence, and the two accompanying images below it. I won't provide artists and titles, that would be confusing. I'm only including them to give you an example of the historical precedents for this idea of the beheading and holding the head. That includes in some of our most iconic historical paintings depicting, for the most part, Salome and the head of St. John the Baptist. There's a very detailed reading of Hans Holbein's The French Ambassadors in your text. If you have the digital edition, it's page 719, and we are in this week, of course, in chapter 22. So I am not going to add more to that reading. I think it's quite proficient. I am, however, in slides 107 and 108 going to bring back in, reintroduce the concept of appropriation. Slides 107 and 108, looking at here, are a contemporary artist, Enrique Chagoya's appropriation of this elongated, the sliding skull from the French ambassadors. 2008 painting in which he has picked up his own idea of the way skulls, and we will see skulls in many modernist and contemporary artists' work, and think about their earlier origins and points of reference. Here, Chagoya is looking at the French ambassadors, 1533, and in 2018, creating something wholly different. Chagoya's videos are included, or one or two of them are included in this year's supplementary materials under audios. He is a contemporary Mexican-born American residing artist who also teaches at Stanford, quite prolific, quite accomplished, and very interested in exploring themes related to colonialism in his work. I am also, one of the videos included talks about his love of Goya, Spanish painter, one of the three greats as mentioned, and we do not get to Goya until we get to lecture guide number 7. We're on lecture guide 4 here. So it's a bit of an introduction to how a contemporary artist works with the idea of honoring his admiration for an artist coming before his time. And I'm also including at the end here Chagoya's reinterpretation of the fashion designers Yves Saint Laurent's riffing off of Mondrian, and that harkens back to our first lecture and a photo of a shoe panel, like a flag hanging on a street. Ending with another Enrique Chagoya image titled Untitled after Yves Saint Laurent as a way of reinforcing this idea of reinterpretation at various periods in time. Chagoya employs masks here, perhaps in a way different than mid-20th century Picasso might have, with his novel at the time for his period way of incorporating, let's call them tribal masks, into his paintings and his sculptures and his multimedia work. Yves Saint Laurent was a very famous 20th century fashion designer. He is here picking up also on the idea of Piet Mondrian's from Der Stil or Die Steidel, a Dutch movement in painting, even interior architecture for homes. This very characteristic style that, if you recall, Mondrian is the inspiration for the shoe that I opened our first week class lecture with. So it may be a little dizzying, but these are all recognizable elements of one person's work, Piet Mondrian, and his very distinctive grid style. Yves Saint Laurent picks up on it in fashion in the late 20th century. And here we have, in the 21st century, Enrique Chagoya employing this idea in his own very stylized work.